Container graveyards. Why America leaves millions of rusting steel boxes by the road. If you drive through the outskirts of the Port of Los Angeles on an ordinary morning, you will see something that is hard to explain. Thousands, even tens of thousands, of steel containers stacked on top of each other into towering columns, stretching all the way to the horizon. They are not containers waiting to be unloaded. They are not containers getting ready to board a ship. They are just standing there empty, cold, and unwanted. From above, through satellite images, these storage yards look like some strange city where every building is the exact same metal box. No residents, no lights at night. Just steel, rust, and time. So the natural question is, why? Why would the country with the largest economy in the world leave these extremely durable, extremely expensive shipping boxes sitting dead by the roadside when, in theory, they could be reused? Brought back into the system? Or at least melted down for steel? The answer is not simple, and it reveals a lot about how global trade really works beneath its shiny surface. A box. But not just a box. Before we go deeper into the paradox, we need to understand what we are actually talking about. A shipping container is not some cheap sheet metal box you see on a construction site. It is one of the most practical engineering designs of the 20th century. A standard 20-foot container weighs more than 2 tons, even when there is nothing inside. It is made from Corten steel, a special alloy with excellent resistance to corrosion in sea salt, extreme heat, and sudden temperature changes. When containers are stacked on the deck of a ship in columns of 8, 9, or 10 layers, the container at the very bottom has to carry the full weight of the ones above it without deforming. And under the harshest conditions, ocean storms, high waves, pressure from multiple directions, a good container can survive 15 to 20 years. According to the World Shipping Council, about 90% of the goods you buy in your lifetime have been inside a container at some point on their journey. Your phone, the shoes you are wearing, the rice cooker in your kitchen. All of them once lived inside those steel boxes, floating across the ocean. And yet, people let them rust. Why? The one-way street across the Pacific. The answer begins with macroeconomics, more specifically, with the huge trade imbalance between the United States and China. The United States-Asia trade route may look like a two-way road on a map, but in reality, it is much closer to a one-way street. Every day, giant container ships leave the ports of Shanghai, Ningbo, and Shenzhen, filled with electronics, clothing, household appliances, and hundreds of other types of goods, then arrive in Los Angeles. The cargo is unloaded. The ships need cargo to return. But the United States does not have enough physical goods to fill that many containers going back the other way. America exports mostly services, software, intellectual property, finance things nobody can stuff into a steel container. The result is a shocking number. During peak periods, the number of containers entering the United States is about 2.5 to 2.7 times higher than the number leaving. Put simply, for every 10 containers that arrive, only about 4 leave with cargo inside. The rest either go back empty or just sit there waiting. At the Port of Savannah, after every major import wave from Asia, empty containers begin piling up with nowhere to go. In Houston, steel boxes sit still for weeks beside rail terminals and logistic zones. In California, Texas, and around major inland rail hubs, containers start stacking up not like cargo in motion, but like surplus equipment nobody knows where to store. The brutal calculation: why not just send them back? The most obvious question is, why not simply load those empty containers onto ships and send them back to China to be used again? This is where the math becomes brutal. Shipping an empty container across the Pacific is not free. You need port cranes to lift it. You need dock workers. You need to pay port fees. And most importantly, an empty container takes up the same space on a ship as a loaded container that actually earns freight revenue. When you add up all the operating costs and opportunity costs, sending a box full of nothing but air from Los Angeles back to China costs around $3,000. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, Chinese container factories are running at full capacity day and night. Around 95% of all new containers in the world are made in China by huge state-owned and private corporations with cheap steel, government support, and unmatched production scale. The factory price of a brand new container is only about $2,000 to $2,200. In other words, a logistics company can pay $3,000 to bring an old, scratched-up, cargo-smelling box from Los Angeles back to Shanghai, or use that money to buy a shiny, brand-new, never-used box right at the export port. Nobody chooses the first option. So the old containers are written off. They are sold to domestic brokers in the United States for $1,000 to $1,500. An industrial tool designed to last 20 years turns into something almost disposable, and its new life begins on land, never to go back to sea again. The farmer's paradox. But the story has an even more bitter layer. While empty container yards are stacked high near ports in California and Texas, hundreds of thousands of American farmers in the central states are struggling to find exactly those boxes. To them, containers are not scrap, they are a way to sell soybeans, corn, cotton, and animal feed directly to Asia without waiting for space on bulk cargo ships. Sometimes the situation becomes so absurd it is hard to believe. Huge fields of empty containers sit near the ports, while farmers deep inland have to reserve containers months in advance and still often get their bookings canceled. Soybean exporters are among the hardest hit. China is one of the largest buyers of American agricultural products, and container shipping is an important channel for many goods. But for shipping lines, the calculation is very simple. If you want to load agricultural products into a container, you have to move that container by rail or truck thousands of miles from the coast into the interior. Then you have to wait for farmers to load the cargo. Then you have to move it all the way back to the coast. That whole process takes time, burns fuel, and carries the risk of missing the next sailing back to Asia. Meanwhile, an empty container sent straight back to China can quickly be used to carry much higher value goods. The result? Shipping companies often ignore American farmers. The National Association of Agriculture and Export Groups began speaking out publicly, accusing ocean carriers of abandoning American exports in order to chase profits on the Asia route. And nobody really had a solution. Recycling? Easier said than done. So if they do not send the containers back, why not simply melt them down for steel? Technically, recycling steel from old containers saves up to 90% of the energy compared with making new steel from ore. On paper, it sounds perfect. In reality, it is a messy problem nobody wants to touch. A container is not a pure block of steel that you can just throw into a furnace. The wooden floor inside is often treated with chemicals against insects and mold because without those chemicals, armies of beetles and fungi would happily travel across the ocean for free along with the cargo. The exterior paint can contain heavy metals. Inside, depending on what goods were carried before, there may still be chemical residues, oil, pesticides, or other contamination. Before an old container can be put into a steel furnace in the United States, you have to inspect it and identify contaminants, remove the wooden floor, sort the waste, handle hazardous materials, provide proper protective equipment for workers, and build an emissions filtering system that meets environmental standards. Add all of that together, and it costs more than the scrap value you get back. That is why most large-scale shipbreaking and metal recycling has almost completely moved out of developed countries. The biggest dismantling yards for ships and containers are now in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, where labor is cheap, environmental standards are more relaxed, and a worker may earn just a few dollars per shift. The Alang shipbreaking yard in India is the most famous example, sometimes called the Beach of Death. Giant ships are deliberately driven onto the sand at high tide, and then thousands of workers spend weeks cutting them apart by hand, often with no safety harnesses, no masks, surrounded by oil fumes, asbestos, and chemicals leaking into the surrounding water. Economically, that system makes money. Ethically, it is another story. In the United States, doing the same thing would cost $30 to $40 per labor hour, plus insurance, plus filtration systems, plus environmental permits, and countless other expenses. The result? An old container is no longer a valuable source of steel. It's an expensive problem that people just want to get rid of as cheaply as possible. Sometimes, letting a steel box rust in a corner of the port for 10 years is cheaper than recycling it properly. Who actually owns those boxes? There is one detail most people do not notice. but it explains much of the indifference in this story. You see a giant Maersk or Costco logo on the side of a container and assume that shipping company owns it. In reality, it is not that simple. Around 50% of all containers in the world are not owned by shipping lines. They belong to specialized container leasing companies such as Triton International or Textainer. The shipping lines only rent those boxes. When a lease expires and the container is sitting somewhere in the middle of America in Chicago, Dallas, or Memphis, the shipping line has two choices: pay to bring it back to Asia or pay a contract penalty and leave it behind. In many cases, paying the penalty is cheaper. The leasing company collects the fee, lists the container for sale on commercial platforms, and a box that once crossed the Pacific 20 times is now sold to someone in Iowa to store farm tools. Nobody in the system has a strong incentive to optimize the full life cycle of the container. Each side pushes responsibility onto someone else, and in the end, the steel box is the loser. The year 2021, when air inside a steel box was worth gold. This single-use container system seemed sustainable until it completely broke down in 2021. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Americans were stuck at home with money still on their bank cards and nowhere to spend it except online shopping. Imports from China exploded. Containers flowed into the United States nonstop, but ports lacked dock workers, roads lacked truck drivers, and cargo began clogging up like a blood clot in an artery. Meanwhile, China, recovering economically earlier than the rest of the world, needed containers to export goods, but there were none. All those boxes were sitting still in American container yards, and nobody had bothered to send them back. The result? The rental price of a standard container jumped from the normal level of about $2,000 to $20,000 or more, a tenfold increase. Suddenly, every old container sitting in a forgotten corner had value. A gray market exploded across the United States. Companies that had once rented containers as tool storage or simply left them unused began selling them back to Asian shipping lines. Boxes once bought for $2,500 were resold for $6,000 to $8,000 because of the shortage. Logistics companies searched for empty containers everywhere, from rail yards to abandoned storage lots across the interior. American Inland Rail suddenly began carrying millions of empty containers from central states back to California. Before that, the route mostly made money from loaded containers. Now even trains full of air were wildly profitable because any recovered container could immediately be put on a ship to Asia. And once again, American farmers paid the price. Shipping companies even canceled agricultural export bookings that had already been made, because sending empty containers back to China was more profitable than waiting for soybeans to be loaded. Agricultural associations publicly accused them. Thousands of tons of American farm products waited for weeks with no transport. The 2021 crisis exposed a simple truth. The global container system was not designed to be fair or sustainable. It was designed to be profitable under normal conditions, and when conditions changed, everyone was exposed. Refrigerated containers, when expensive things get treated with respect. In the world of containers, there is one special type that is almost never abandoned: refrigerated containers, also known as reefer containers. From the outside, they look almost exactly like regular containers, the same rectangle, the same basic size. But inside, they're a completely different world. One end of the container holds an industrial refrigeration system with a compressor, fans, and temperature controls. The walls are thickly insulated. Inside, a network of sensors tracks humidity, temperature, and airflow minute by minute. Many models are connected to satellite systems, and GPS, a cargo owner sitting in an office in New York, can know exactly what the temperature is inside that container in the middle of the Pacific. The price of a new refrigerated container? From $15,000 to $30,000. Not because the steel is more expensive, but because of the engineering system inside. The cargo inside refrigerated containers usually allows no room for error. Bananas travel at one temperature, meat at another, vaccines at another, and some pharmaceutical products must be kept exactly between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius throughout the journey without drifting even slightly. If the refrigeration system fails for just a few hours, an entire shipment worth millions of dollars may have to be thrown away. That is why nobody leaves refrigerated containers in a corner of a port waiting for better days. After every trip, they are inspected, cleaned, put through compressor diagnostics, fitted with new filters, and checked electronically. When they need to be returned to Asia, companies are willing to pay to ship them back, even completely empty, sometimes even keeping the refrigeration system running throughout the trip because leaving it off for too long can damage the equipment. The result is a slightly funny contradiction right next to a yard where ordinary containers are rusting because nobody wants to send them back. A ship may be carrying thousands of empty refrigerated containers back to Asia with full power and maintenance simply because they're too expensive to abandon. Value creates care. Cheapness creates neglect. When steel boxes change careers, but not every abandoned container ends its life by rusting in place. A large number of them are given an entirely different second life in a market people call container architecture. In the United States, this market is especially active in places that need something fast, cheap, and not too boring. Freight Farms builds high-tech hydroponic farms entirely inside containers. According to the company's figures, one unit takes up only about 30 square meters, but can produce the same agricultural output as 1 to 2 hectares of traditional farmland. These farms can be placed right next to supermarkets, on empty urban lots, or near schools, places where there is no farmland but still a need for fresh vegetables. The New York architecture studio Lot Eck has spent years turning containers into artistic and residential spaces. Whitney Art Studio, Cube Socrates, Carroll House, these projects do not just use containers as decorative cladding. They integrate the rigid container form as a real architectural module. In Phoenix, Steel Plus Spark creates compact homes from containers complete with solar panels, and they can be installed within days. And these uses are not limited to the United States. Angola has community libraries made from containers. Indonesia has libraries assembled from 8 steel boxes. Schools, galleries, temporary shops, emergency housing containers appear everywhere like Lego bricks of the modern world. The most impressive example came from Qatar. At the 2022 World Cup, stadium 974 inches, Lusail was built from exactly 974 shipping containers. The number was both the stadium's name and Qatar's international dialing code. Instead of an expensive concrete structure that risked becoming a white elephant after the tournament, engineers created a giant steel Lego block with a capacity of 40,000 spectators. The steel boxes were not just exterior decoration, they formed stands, stairways, and even restroom areas. The gaps between the containers, combined with the stadium's seaside location, created natural ventilation and reduced the need for air conditioning, something other stadiums in Qatar had to spend huge amounts of money to provide. After the tournament ended, the stadium was fully dismantled so the materials could be reused or recycled, the first temporary stadium of that scale in the world. The ending of a story that never really ends. Looking back at the whole story, empty containers are not left behind in America because someone is lazy or irresponsible. They are the inevitable result of a series of economically rational decisions at every level. Shipping lines calculate opportunity costs. Chinese factories mass-produce new containers more cheaply than the cost of shipping old ones back. American environmental standards make recycling unprofitable, and nobody in the chain is fully responsible for the life cycle of the box. When everyone acts rationally according to their own interests, the overall result becomes something nobody wants. Massive rusting container yards, farmers without boxes to export goods, and a system so fragile that one pandemic can make container prices rise tenfold in just a few months. Until someone solves the basic trade imbalance between the United States and Asia, something no minister or CEO truly controls by themselves, the story will keep repeating. Containers will keep flowing in, some of them will keep being left behind. And every now and then, one lucky steel box will be turned into a hydroponic farm, an art gallery, or a small piece of some stadium in a distant city. Not a perfect ending, but at least it is a second life.